This is a Hoops Analyst podcast.
Right. We're here today with Paul Knepper, an author who's written a fantastic new book called Moses Malone, The Life of a Basketball Prophet. I spoke with Paul about 5 years ago. Was it 5 years ago?
Yeah.
5 years ago for your first book, The New York Knicks of the 90s. And I enjoyed the book, which I thought was a vivid retelling of the end of that time. And actually took me back. I was like, I feel like I'm a kid again. And I was kind of bummed when it was over because I was like, now I'm like a late 40 something schmuck working a job. But it really took me back. And your style of writing is a lot of fun. It has the prose that it grabs the reader, but also is meticulously written. It has cites for pretty much everything you put in there, and it has that. I believe you told me you had a legal training, so you like a good fact section of a legal brief that draws the reader in, but also tells the real facts. So I particularly appreciated that given my background. And the same as I can say for the new book, which I really enjoyed as well. I've looked at some other interviews that you've done, so I didn't want to recreate what other people have asked, but I have to do that a little bit just to get the ball rolling. So why Moses? What drew you to Moses as a character?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing is I think Moses is kind of started from a place of curiosity, really. I mean, Moses is one of the greatest, most impactful players in basketball history, and nobody really talks about him anymore. And actually, I think the seed got planted maybe like 10 years ago, and you and I, Harlan, we're both, I guess, amateur historians of the game, and I know a great deal about most of the game's, all-time greats, but I didn't know anything about Moses. I actually went on Amazon. I was like, I'm gonna buy a book about Moses and learn more about Moses. And there was no book about Moses. I was very surprised about that at the time. So I think I kind of tucked that away. And I think he's important as a trailblazer. He was the first modern day player to jump straight from high school to pros. And there's a lot around that whole story. And this guy, he's one of only not 9 players to win 3 or more NBA MVP awards. I mean, that's a very prestigious list. He was the greatest player on one of the best teams of all time, the 1982-83 76ers. He's widely regarded as the greatest offensive rebounder of all time, and actually, statistically speaking, by a huge margin. So I think he needs to be talked about when people talk about the greats of the game. And I was hoping that this book would kind of bring his story to light, particularly for younger generations who didn't see him.
Yeah, when I think of Moses, he sort of was at his peak when I was just sort of watching the game in the early 80s. And we'll talk a little bit about how the aging process with him, which was very interesting. But what I did remember was relentless border, faux, and the fact that he was a little bit taciturn. So what were your expectations and what was reality in terms of the record that you could review of recreating his life?
Yeah, you're right. I think there were some limits because Moses, was notorious for being standoffish with the media. So I don't know that there was as much information provided by him, but you supplement the written record, what's out there in terms of articles and books and podcasts or whatever else, by talking to people. And so I interviewed over 250 people for the book. I spoke to dozens of people from his hometown of Petersburg, Virginia, the kid who grew up 2 houses down from him, other people from the neighborhood, high school teammates and friends and opponents and classmates. And you kind of do that all the way up through the end of his life. And so I learned a great deal. In a way, it was fun because he was a mystery to me, and I think is a mystery to a lot of people. And because taciturn side of him, but there was so much more to Moses that I didn't know about and really enjoyed learning about.
And in terms of people like from the NBA, like either writers or players or executives, is there any people in particular you got a lot more than you thought you were going to get?
Hakeem was great. I really loved talking to Hakeem. He gave me a lot of stuff about, and Moses was a mentor to Hakeem, and Hakeem really went in depth with me. I didn't know. You never know what you get from anyone. I think particularly superstars are, they've done so many interviews. They're somewhat jaded, and so I really appreciated that Hakeem gave me a lot of time, more time than I would have expected, and went into more detail than I would have expected about, when he first met Moses, and it was at this place, Fondy Rec Center in Houston, and Moses kind of took him under his wing and looked out for him, and it was evident just in Hakeem's tone, even more so maybe than his words, of how much he appreciated that and respected Moses. So that was. I was thrilled to get him on the phone in the first place, and then, particularly excited and grateful for all that he gave me.
So what about some of the paper sources? I know I wrote a little bit about Moses a couple of years ago when he passed away, and the books I looked at were stuff that were pretty much in the record. And everyone knows those books, but I had totally forgotten some of the points were made. If you look, two books in particular that I looked at were Halberstam's Breaks of the Game, which went into, his brief time with the Blazers, and how Moses somehow was on property of three teams in a short period of time, and no one knew what the hell they had with him, except for the Blazers sort of realized it a bit too late. I don't know. And I guess I should go in order. I'm asking more than one thing at once because it's an exciting topic for me. But did you use Halberstam's book as a jump off point as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can't imagine how many authors of historical basketball books use Halberstam's book as a jumping off point, right? Yeah, definitely, and that led me to a couple of other books. I can't even think of the name now of the president of the Blazers at the time. But he wrote a book, Promoter Ain't a Dirty Word. And I had the privilege of interviewing Bill Walton not long before he died about the Blazers stuff, and a couple of others, Lionel Hollins, Lloyd Neal, about those Blazers period. That was helpful. I did a lot of books. There was a biography of Lefty Driesell, who was kind of an important figure in the book, and that book was very helpful to learn more about Lefty. There's a book called Caught in the Net that Tates Locke wrote, who Tates was the coach at Clemson, and I haven't been able to nail down if this is true, but supposedly the movie Blue Chips remember that movie with Shaq and
Nick Nolte,
yeah, supposedly that's based on Tates Locke's story, and Tates had heavily recruited Moses, and that was just a great window into what went on in college recruiting in the mid 70s. So there are a lot, it's kind of all over the place. Jonathan Abrams wrote a really good book about, can't think of the name of it now, but it was about the high school to pro generation, Kobe and McGrady and Garnett and LeBron and Boys Among Men, I want to say. That was really helpful in a weird way, because he actually starts the book with Moses. He talks about Moses' story in the intro. I didn't really get anything new about Moses, but it was very helpful in kind of being able to contrast what Moses went through when he made the jump to what Kobe and Garnett and LeBron did years later. And so that book was very helpful. But yeah, you get bits and pieces. I read a couple of books about the 82, 83 76ers, or one book about that team, one book about the history of the 76ers that also talks about that team. And you you get stuff all over. I mean, I got some stuff in Larry Bird's autobiography, Drive. A lot, like, there was no book on Moses, but a lot of his teammates, coaches, opponents, Dr. J's autobiography, he talks about Moses. So a lot of those people around Moses wrote books, which turned out to be very helpful.
And the other book sort of like takes us, like, as I run through, like basically a rough outline of his career with you. The Loose Balls, which, like sort of, which was like the Rosetta Stone of his recruiting. And what got me about that, the recruiting itself and the book, is I forget who, but one of the recruiters for the ABA made the point that he was looking around, and Oral Roberts was promising to, cure Moses' mom's ulcers. Drizel was obviously making promises, and as were others. And the ABA guys said they looked around and they all thought Moses was stupid, and he was very much not stupid. So and I totally forgot that anecdote until I looked back now. But it was my lens in which when I started reading your book, and you really started putting it together. But what did you learn about the recruitment process that new or that you didn't know before that was out there?
A lot of the Tate's Lock stuff, as I said, with Clemson, that was mind blowing what went on there. And some of it was specific to recruiting. Tate's actually, not long after Moses, he committed to Maryland and then he ended up going pro. Not long after that, Tate's lost his job. And in part, it was because they found the university believed that he had promised Moses' mother a house, the whole house. So that was crazy. The Oral Roberts story is, really crazy. There's a lot of, I spoke to a couple of friends of Moses, high school friends, both of whom told me that different schools offered them a scholarship if they got Moses to go there. This guy, a guy who was an assistant coach at VCU at the time, basically told me Moses had a distant cousin named Morris Fultz, who was also his high school teammate. And this guy told me basically VCU, that guy was a year older than Moses. And he was like, he was an okay player, but we just recruited him in the hopes that he would bring along Moses a year later. I talked to this coach from Minnesota, University of Minnesota, telling me how they had like the dance squad, the girl dance squad, like come to the hotel where Moses was staying, and Moses was lying on a lounge chair at the pool, and they all put on like a private dance show for him. Crazy stuff. The schools would set him up on dates when he visited. They'd have girls call him, when he went back home, and call him, and pretty girls trying to convince him to come to the school there. So it was crazy. And then, there were the offers of payments and cash and cars and his coaches were offered jobs at different universities if they delivered him. And there's a great line in the book that I love. Larry Merchant, who's, pretty well known as a boxing commentator. He said at the time, I'm botching this quote, but the essence of it is, by any honest definition, Moses would have been a professional, whether he went to college or not. It was, some of that stuff was really crazy.
And how bitter was Lefty?
Bitter, very bitter. Angry. The University of Maryland was angry. Like the athletic director at Maryland requested a congressional inquiry into the kids jumping from high school to pros. I think, and it wasn't just Maryland who lost him. I think a lot of people, coaches and administrators around the country, were angry because they viewed Moses as a threat. It was like, oh my God, if the top talent starts going from high school to pros, that's going to affect the product on the court in the college game, and that's going to affect the bottom line, and it's going to affect our salaries and everything. So I think a lot of people viewed him as a threat. Lefty was angry, but Lefty got over it. Lefty and Moses remained friends until the day Moses died. When Lefty got inducted to the Hall of Fame, he had Coach K, George Ravlin, and maybe John Thompson. It was definitely Coach K and George Ravlin, and maybe someone else up there. And during his speech, he said if Moses was still alive, Moses would be introducing me to the Hall of Fame. And it was kind of funny. He would put out in like the University of Maryland programs or like yearbooks in the late 70s that listed great NBA players who went to Maryland. They included Moses on the list, which was funny. But really, to give you an example, Moses was supposed to play a golf tournament the day he died, and he was due to have dinner with Lefty the night he died. So they really became lifelong friends. I think, Lefty was he he was very angry, but he got over it. I think he understood it.
Yeah, why do you think, I guess the next year Willoughby and Dawkins came out, sort of following the trend, and then Bupkis for about 20 years. What do you think stemmed the tide on high schoolers to the NBA for that period of time?
Two guys, I think, Moses did it, and Moses was an all-star in his first season in the ABA, and so a lot of people were like, oh, well, guys can come in from high school and make an immediate impact or be really good. I mean, Dal Dawkins was a good player. I think he had 14 years in the league. But there was always the sense that he could have been a much better player. He was an incredible physical specimen. And I think the big thing is Dawkins and Willoughby, Dawkins was a clown. And I heard that from teammates. He was always clowning around, never took anything seriously. Willoughby, fair or not, I don't know enough about him, got a label as being difficult to coach and immature himself. And so both of those guys pretty quickly developed reputations as being immature, and there was this perception that they weren't ready for the league. And very quickly it went from Moses being the new template to Moses being an anomaly. And I think coaches and organizations didn't want these young, immature high schoolers on their teams anymore.
And I guess his ABA years, you mentioned he was an all-star his first year at Utah. Then I think they folded and he ended up in St. Louis. But people don't really talk much about his ABA years other than that he looked like he had talent. And my perception was both in Utah and St. Louis, they didn't fully appreciate him as a superstar. You agree with that? And why do you think that was?
I do. I think I don't think he was superstar ready yet. I think he was still very raw, particularly offensively. He wasn't a guy you could throw with a ball into and he'd get you a basket, not at that point in his career. And so his I don't think his decision making was quite there yet where it was when he was, say, 25. You think of a guy like a Kevin Garnett who did it 20 years later, like he wasn't ready to be a superstar his first couple of years. He was a good player. He made a real impact, but I don't think Moses had the experience yet or the offensive game to be a superstar at that point.
Yeah, well, let me put it another way. So you mentioned Garnett, like he wasn't a star right away, but people looked at him like this guy is gold, and he was like had a future value that was very much valued. Whereas Moses, I think people thought Marvin Barnes was much better, and like Moses got respect, but he was like considered like prospect. Do you think that was based on people not understanding what they had, or a legitimate assessment that Barnes had something that Moses didn't quite have yet?
Yeah, I think some of that was I think the Utah Stars knew what they had. I think Tom Masalki, the coach of the Stars, knew what they had. I think that's why a couple years after, or I guess a year after the Stars folded, Masalki pushed the Rockets GM Ray Patterson really hard to get Moses. Masalki was then the coach in Houston, and he was like, he basically harassed Patterson. You got to get this guy. You got to get this guy. You got to get this guy. He knew, early in Moses' rookie season, Masalki was comparing to Bill Russell. And this was a seasoned NBA coach, ABA coach, who was saying this. I talked to his teammates in the NBA with the Stars. I think they knew, but he was All-Star's first season. His second season, he broke his foot in training camp and missed the first few months, and then he was traded to St. Louis in what was just a weird situation, a very crowded front court. And I think a lot of it too was he wasn't quite back in shape yet. And I think St. Louis, that whole situation was a mess with Barnes. They changed coaches a few weeks after Moses got there. It was kind of a circus there in St. Louis, and I think Moses was overweight at that point because of the long layoff, and so I think that combination of things, that second season was really a lost season for him. And then he gets to the NBA, and there was this tremendous stigma against ABA guys. There are a lot of NBA guys who look down their nose at the ABA, and there were people who, if they hadn't seen Moses play, and the NBA wasn't on TV, so if you were an NBA executive, you already had a bias against ABA players, and unless your team happened to have played an exhibition game against a certain ABA player, you really had no idea he was or how good he was. And there's a great story in the book where Moses, the Trailblazers selected Moses in the ABA dispersal draft, and they really drafted him to trade him. And the general manager of the Trailblazers calls up Eddie Donovan, the general manager of the New York Knicks, and says, "Are you interested in Moses?" And Eddie Donovan says, "Well, is he better than John Gianelli, who was like a journeyman backup center?" Like they just didn't know. It's incomprehensible now, right? That you would have that guys would not, that NBA general managers would not know how good certain players were, but they really kind of disregarded the ABA and just hadn't seen him play and were dismissive of him.
Yeah, I see in the dispersal draft. That's why I'm looking at the other monitor. He went fifth in the ABA dispersal draft. Barnes went ahead of him, and Ron Boone for some reason, which not really sure. I mean, he was a decent player, but
Yeah.
And so let's talk about that weird segment of time where he went from the Blazers to Buffalo to Houston. When you talked to Walton and other people, did anyone think that Walton and Malone could play together?
Walton did. Yeah, the problem really was Maurice Lucas, in that because Moses did, when he got to Houston, he played a lot of power forward his first couple of years in the NBA, but Portland also took Maurice Lucas in the dispersal draft, and Lucas was a more established, viewed, I think, more dependable player and a very good player in his own right, and they kind of viewed Walton and Moses, and they believe they believe Walton and Lucas was going to be their starting front court, and Moses was making a lot of money for a backup, and they didn't want to pay that much money for a bench player. Is ultimately what it came down to. They had a solid backup in Lloyd Neal who could play both positions, and they didn't want to invest that much in Moses. So I don't think it was so much that they thought Moses and Walton couldn't play together, as they already had their two starters at the 4 and 5, and didn't want to spend that much money on a backup.
What this popped into my head because I see Lucas went second. They played together in St. Louis. Do you know what Moses's relationship with Lucas was? Lucas has been going a long time too.
I don't. I don't know a lot about it. I think they were friendly. They were friendly terms. I don't think they were like really close, but Walton told me that Lucas used to, in the locker room, the brief time they were together, Moses and Walton both stuttered, and Lucas used to make fun of them like crazy about their speech impediments. And Walton, said it was a good fun, and everybody would be laughing. But that's what he remembers about that dynamic.
That's pretty funny. So let's talk about the Houston years. So Nasalki, or is it Nasalki? Is that how you pronounce it?
Nasalki, yeah.
Yeah. He obviously was a huge fan, as was Del Harris. Houston teams were like pretty good. It seems like their one year where they made the run to the finals. With Moses, I don't want to say it's an anomaly, but definitely seemed like everything broke right for them that year.
Yeah, I mean they were 40 and 42, right? I mean that's pretty crazy. But hey, they beat the defending champion Lakers in the first round. You know, with Magic and Kareem. That's it was one of those mini series. You had to best 2 out of 3 games, but they won it. And yeah, they beat a couple good teams. No, it wasn't. After they got past the Lakers, it wasn't the greatest conference, the greatest competition, but Moses really carried that team. Rick Barry told me that he spent his last 2 seasons in the NBA with the Rockets, and Barry told me that those are the most talented teams he played on by far. And his take, in typical Rick Barry blunt fashion, said it was the coaching. It was the worst. They had terrible coaching. That's why they didn't win championships. I don't know about that, but I don't think they had the most talent. It was Moses. Calvin Murphy was a really good player. I think part of the problem is Rick Barry and Tom Janovich were really at the end of their rope because they were, Rick Barry's an all-time great, and Rudy played in several All-Star games. He was a really good player. They were both really at the end of their careers, and so I think I don't think they had the firepower to really be a great team.
Yeah, the weird thing was the best team by record for Moses in Houston was the first year he went over. They went to the it's hard to say now, but they were in the Eastern Conference,
Right.
and they went to the Eastern Conference Finals. So it was definitely strange. Did he want to leave Houston, or his feelings more business?
No, business. He very much wanted to stay. It was just a lot of kind of weird circumstances that led to him leaving. So he left in '82 as the MVP. He just won the MVP award, and a couple of years earlier, the team was owned by George Maloof, and Moses, going back a couple of years, told his agent, "I want to sign a long-term deal with the Rockets." And I spoke to his agent about this. He said they basically had a deal done. They were very close to a deal with Maloof a couple of years earlier, and then George Maloof died suddenly of a heart attack and left the team to his, I think, 24-year-old son Gavin. And from that point on, there was a lot of instability in that, Gavin was 24 years old, that he wasn't really ready to run a team. And there was a lot of talk about whether they were going to sell the team, whether they weren't going to sell the team. So that was one thing. They never really made him a reasonable offer leading up to his free agency. And if they did, he would have stayed. He would have never tested free agency. He loved Houston. Houston was home. After his career ended, he moved back to Houston and lived there for the rest of his life. He really liked it there. His family was settled there. He had, an aunt and a cousin there who were really like a mother and a sister to him. He had made a lot of friends. He grew up in Houston. He really kind of became a man and grew up in Houston and didn't want to go. But then another thing happened, which was 1981, restricted free agency was introduced in the NBA. And salaries skyrocketed. And basically in the summer of '82, when Moses was a free agent, there was collusion. The coaches, it was like, I think only 7 of the players drafted in the first 2 rounds of the draft had been signed by like late September. There were a lot of veteran free agents that were just not signed. The teams, the owners were taking a stand and say, we're not signing people. And that was an issue with Malone. And there weren't that many teams that could afford him in the first place, frankly. Back in, you could analogize it to before, because there was no salary cap then, right? So you could analogize it to like baseball now. If Shohei Ohtani's a free agent, realistically, like you got like the Dodgers, the Yankees, the Mets, the Red Sox, maybe a couple other teams have the funds to sign him. That was what it was like with Moses then. He signed a contract for $2 million at that time. And the highest paid player in the league at that time was Kareem at like 1.2. So it was almost double what the highest paid player in the league was making. To give you, I mean, Dr. J wasn't even making $1 million. And so there weren't that many teams that could afford him, and that limited his options. And ultimately, Harold Katz of the 76ers stepped up and made him this $12 million offer over 2 years. And the GM, it was a right of first refusal then. The GM of the Rockets went to their new owner. They were just sold like a week before this offer was made to Moses. And the new owner, Charlie Thomas, Ray Patterson went to him and said, Ray, we have to match this offer. Moses is the team. We can't lose this guy. He just won the MVP award. And Charlie Thomas said, Ray, I just paid $12 million for the whole team. I can't pay that for one player. And that was it. They ended up doing a trade because the 76ers were a little concerned that they would match it. And Harold Katz told me he didn't want to screw over that Charlie Thomas was a brand new owner, and he thought it was bad for the league to take the MVP off a team with a new owner. And so those two things led them to come up with a trade that worked for both sides. But Moses really didn't want to go. It was just way too much money for him to leave on the table.
And Houston ended up getting rewarded for their cheapness by getting Sampson and Hakeem in successive years. But
yeah, it worked out.
You can do everything wrong and everything right, and somehow things pay off. That's basketball. Now let's talk a little bit about the Philly years. I won't talk about everything, but just a couple of things that interest me a little bit. First is historically, how good do you think the 82-83 team is?
Oh man, I mean, they were loaded. It might be a top 5 all-time team, maybe top 10. I would say likely top 10, maybe top 5. I just think they had a lot of great players, and the players fit together well, and they were a really good team before he got there. They had just lost in the 82 finals. They lost in the finals 3 times in the previous 6 years. And each time it was not just in the finals, but in the playoffs too, it was to a team with a great center. It was,
I don't see Magic scoring 42 on Moses in 1980.
No, exactly. But in 77 they lost to Walton. In 80 and 82 they lost to Kareem and Magic for that one game. They lost a couple times in the playoffs to the Celtics with Robert Parrish. And back in that day, you needed a great center, and Dawkins wasn't great. Moses was great. But yeah, to your point, I mean, you have Dr. J there, an all-time great player. Bobby Jones is in the Hall of Fame. Maurice Cheeks is in the Hall of Fame. And Andrew Toney would be in the Hall of Fame if his career wasn't cut short by chronic foot injuries. So you had a number of Hall of Famers on that squad. And most of them had played together for a number of years. So there was a familiarity and a cohesion there that Moses was able to blend into very well. But basically you had a team that went to the finals and then added the MVP of the league. So that's they ended up winning 67 games, 60.
Yeah, I think it was 67.
Something like that. And Billy Cunningham told me we easily could have won 70. I think it was a little less, actually, now I'm saying it.
Oh, I got the basketball reference handy. Take a look at the 65 and 17.
Okay, 65. But Moses sat out the last handful of games. They had a number of injuries down the stretch, and Cunningham really took the foot off the gas because it was that team, with the success that they've had in the previous several seasons, they were only going to be judged by the postseason. So I think if they put pedal to the metal, they might have won 70, but that just wasn't important to them. So yeah, that's an all-time great team.
Yeah. And the other thing is, you brought up Katz, who is kind of an interesting figure too. So part of the Moses story in Philly is they won in 82-83. They sort of had some up and down where they lost to the Nats in 84 inexplicably. Were pretty good with Barkley, and then they broke it up for they traded Moses, of course, for Ruland, and then traded the pick that would be Doherty for Hinson. Just sort of a weird ending to Moses' career in Philly. And what I had read was that there were two explanations for not necessarily the return, but why they wanted to trade Moses. He wanted a contract. Cats didn't want to pay it. And he was underwhelmed by the playoff performance of the team. And there was a thought that Barkley, being a low post guy, couldn't mesh with Moses long term. What did you find, and what did Cats tell you?
Yes, most of that is correct. The one thing I would correct is they were actually impressed with the playoff performance. What happened was Moses broke the orbital bone in his eye in like February, March of '86, and was out for the rest of the season, missed the playoffs. And they won one round. They won the first round, and the second round they lost in 7 games to the Bucks. So they went to the second round, game 7, against a really good team without Moses. And they were playing a different style of basketball. At that point, Moses had become more of a half-court guy. And, they were relying on Barkley, and they had a rookie named Terry Catledge, and they were getting up and down the floor a lot more. Barkley was so athletic when he was young. And there was kind of this idea that, hey, maybe we're actually better off without Moses in the front office. At least the players didn't think so, but the front office, that was an idea. The other thing was, you hit it on the head that him and Barkley was a low post guy, and they were kind of taking up some of the same space. Moses had slipped a little. There's no doubt about that. He wasn't in '86. He wasn't that MVP caliber player anymore. And Cats made comments about, I think he was 31 at the time, and Cats said he's an old 31 because he came to the league at so young, and he led the league in minutes a few times, I believe. But there were seasons where Moses averaged over 40 minutes a game, and so Cats was kind of saying he's got a lot of mileage on those legs and on those knees, and he's not the player he was. He did demand a new contract with 2 years left on his deal, which Cats was not happy about. And he clashed with his coach. Matty Gukas had taken over for Billy Cunningham that season, and there were some problems between Moses and Matty Gukas. There were some problems between Moses and Cats. Cats was critical of the team. Moses fired back. They fought over Andrew Toney. Cats was very critical of Toney for not playing. He thought he was basically faking his injury, and Moses came out very strongly in defense of Toney. Rightfully so. He was right. Toney had fractures in his foot that they weren't able to see with the technology at the time, basically. And because they couldn't see it, Cunningham thought he was faking. So there was a lot going on there, and there was tension, and Moses was sliding. And I think they thought, if we were going to trade Moses, this is the time to do it. He still has a couple of years left on his contract. He's going to be harder to trade when he's got 1 year left. He's going to decline further and have less value. And, we think this might be the time to move on.
So, in your personal opinion, forgetting the return, was the theory sound in trading him?
I don't think so, because I think with Barkley there, you still had Doc at the end. I think you might have been able to contend for another year or two. I don't, the return is big, right? If you brought back a couple of really good young players or top picks or something like that, and you could then jumpstart or rebuild around Barkley, that would be a different story. But the return they got ended up being disastrous.
Yeah. Did you talk to Ruland?
I did talk to Ruland. Yeah.
Yeah. What's his perspective? No one ever quotes him on this.
I mean, Ruland was happy about the trade. He was adamant. I mean, he felt that his knee was fine. He took tests on the knee. They did tests on the knee. That there was a lot of concern about the knee before the trade, but he said the doctors cleared him. They said he was fine. He thought he was fine. He turned out to be damaged goods, but he didn't think he was. And so, he recognizes, obviously, it didn't work out for Philly. I mean, I think he played like 6 games for them. So that it turned out to be disastrous. But and obviously, and you could still hear the disappointment in his voice. Jeff Lou was a really good player. He was an all-star. And to have your career cut short young like that is hard to swallow.
Yeah. What about Katz? Did Katz express like he should have done what he should have done differently, or is he still okay with? I know
No,
Katz
yeah, I don't think so. I think he kind of went back. I mean, obviously he recognized it didn't work out, but I think he felt that there was sound reasoning behind it, and didn't sound like he regretted the move. Really, he just he regretted the results.
and I guess they worked it out because he came back near the end for a year. And I take it were all bygones gone, or was there something?
No, there were, and somewhat quickly they did, because there were Moses had a lot of choice words for Katz. He was pissed off the Cats traded him. He was pissed off the Cats traded him while he was injured. He didn't like the Cats didn't call him immediately to tell him about it. And I think Moses was a very proud man. I think he was hurt that he was traded. He liked Philly. He had a lot of good friends there. He wasn't happy to go to Washington. Wasn't a very good team. I don't think he was happy to go there. And so he lashed out at Katz a lot publicly in the weeks after the trade. But by the next season, his tone had changed somewhat. I think the anger calmed down, and he realized this was a business decision. And they definitely did patch things up. They were, I know Katz went to Moses' funeral, obviously many years later, but Katz did welcome him back that season. The idea was to kind of mentor Sean Bradley, the rookie Sean Bradley.
Yeah. And people forget about those Washington years. Those teams they weren't great, but they weren't like as abjectly terrible as Washington teams usually are. It was like
the current team.
Yeah, the most of the teams for the last 45 years. They take the Pistons to 5 games one year.
They did, yeah.
Yeah, but it was a wonky team because we talked about Barkley not fitting with post-up game not fitting with Malone, but here Moses was actually paired with Bernard King, who wasn't like, as a fan you don't get excited about like some 30 somethings posting up every time, but what did you learn about those years?
Yeah, they were tough because they were very mediocre. The first year I think they were right around 500. And his second year there, they were, I don't know, maybe 38 and 44. They were a little below. Expectations were high after bringing in Moses. I think probably a little unreasonably high based on the roster. Bernard wasn't there the first year. Bernard came the second year Moses was there. And they had Bernard and they had Jeff Malone, who was a good scorer. And it was like, hey, we might have 20-point scorers here. We could be a really good team. And it didn't pan out. I think it was just a very average roster ultimately. And, obviously Moses and Bernard were on the downside. Both could still play, but they weren't the Bernard and Moses of the early 80s anymore. And it kind of ended in frustration because they weren't as good as people had hoped or wanted, and Moses received some of the blame for that. But yeah, you're right. They are a kind of forgotten couple of years in there.
Yeah, wow.
My favorite stuff from the Washington years is I talked to Muggsy Bogues, and Muggsy, Moses, and Manute Bol were all good friends. And Muggsy would tell me that, like, the three of them would go to clubs together and hang out and party, and just the image of Muggsy, Manute, and Moses, walking into a club together or, walking through the airport side by side is just hilarious.
Yeah, that's he played with all the tall guys, Sean Bradley and Manute. It's kind of funny.
And he played with Muggsy and Spud.
Oh, right, Spud. Well, that leads to the next thing. He signed with Atlanta in '88, I think, and that was people forget, a legitimately good team. They didn't, and Moses was still considered if not the best center in the league, he was definitely probably top 5, top 10, 6 center. I think that team was expected to be well, they were good in the regular season, but they ended up with bitter disappointment in the playoffs. What was the vibe on that 88-89 Hawks team?
Yeah, I mean, when Moses got there were some people figured them to win a championship. It was that high of expectations because in 1988, there was the famous duel between Dominique and Larry Bird in Game 7. The Hawks had won 50 games or more in the 3 seasons leading up to that year, leading up to acquiring Moses. And then, as I noted in that season before, they lost in the second round. They took a great Celtics team to Game 7, and that was a close Game 7. And so there was kind of this idea that their center was Tree Rollins, who was a very good defensive player, kind of a leader in the locker room, but he'd score like 4 points a game. He gave you nothing offensively. And there was this idea. They also added Reggie Theus, who had been like a 20-point scorer on bad teams, albeit, but there was this idea that Moses and Reggie were going to add a whole lot of pop to the offense, and that this team that won 52 games last year and went to Game 7 in the second round could win it all. Maybe Moses can do for Atlanta what he did for the 76ers. I mean, yeah, what he did for the 76ers and get them over the hump. But it just kind of didn't work out. It was a few things. It was and Moses was still an all-star. He made the all-star team his first year in Atlanta. He was still a very good player. Maybe the second best center in the league after Hakeem. Maybe Ewing had surpassed him at that time, but probably best, as probably best top 3, 4 at least. But they had something, Kevin Willis broke his foot before the season started, and that was a big loss for them. There was a lot of turmoil in the locker room. That group had been together for a lot of years, and Mike Fratello had been the coach for a number of years, and Fratello was a screamer. You talk to guys and they'll say he was great with X's and O's, but it sounds like he wasn't necessarily a great communicator with the players, and he yelled a lot. And screamers, with a screamer for 4 or 5 years, you start to tune them out. And I think the Hawks did that. And there was a lot of resentment. There was a lot of fighting back and forth between Dominique and Fratello, and other players in Fratello. And I think that was an issue. But yeah, it's somewhat hard to say too. And some of the guys I talked to struggled with it because they went through the roster and like, we should have been better. We should have been a great team, and they just didn't get there. Something just didn't click.
Yeah, they were pretty good. I did a little work on them a couple of years ago, and I think Theus took a lot of the blame for the team washing out. But really, they were plenty good in the regular season, in my mind. My editorial. The Detroit Pistons developed into a better team, perhaps because Daly was a better coach than Fratello. I don't know. Isaiah might be better or whatever. And the Bucks outplayed them in a series where Bucks were all injured, and that really broke them up. And I guess Moses lasted a couple more years as a starter, I guess Moses could probably get a double-double if you played him, even in with Sean Bradley. If they played him the minutes, he probably could have still put up 10 and 10 in '94.
Yeah.
But I guess he started to get a little long in the tooth, where the people started to think that the stats, which were still pretty good, were not as good as the result on the court.
Yeah, I think that's true. And some of the stats were going down. He still got a lot of offensive rebounds, but I think it was his second year at Atlanta, I think he finished 30th in the league in defensive rebounds. And there were things that he did when he was younger that he could get away with. For example, Moses never boxed anyone out. And back then people did actually box out. He never boxed anyone out then, but he could get away with that when he was 25 and had spry legs. But all of a sudden, he was giving up. His man was getting a lot of offensive rebounds, and the turnovers, which you lived with when he was younger, were harder to swallow when he was shooting 43% from the field instead of 55% from the field. So a lot of you're right. Like the totals were there, but I would say the efficiency certainly dropped off. And you can look at his field goal percentage too, from the early 80s to the late 80s, it kind of went down every year. Um, and then in his final year in Atlanta in 89, 90, it was kind of well, 88, 89, was last year for Tello, and the wheels just fell off. And then 89, 90, Bob Weiss took over, and kind of midway through the season, he moved Moses to the bench, which Moses was not happy about. But and that was, it was hard. I have one of the chapters of my book is called Superstar in Decline. And I talk about this quote that Jeff Van Gundy had told me years ago and likes to use it, that the hardest thing to coach in basketball is a superstar in decline. Because it's the pride, the pride that is partially what got them to be so great, to overcome the obstacles along the way, to overcome the doubts that are all around you. It's that pride in yourself and your ability. And because of that, they're often the last one to know that their game is slipping. They can't do it anymore. And they don't want to be told that that's what's happening.
Well, the interesting thing about Moses, and I think it's sort of speaks to his character, is he did play a couple of years after it was clear he couldn't really do it anymore. And he seemed to be both on Philly and later on San Antonio. Was that his final season?
Yeah.
He seemed to be, a good trooper and a good teammate, and was willing to be like the backup center and be a team player.
Yeah, it's remarkable, So that was the 89-90 season, where he lost his starting job, and it was like, okay, this is, he's clearly well on the way to his decline is pretty far along, and he still played 5 more years after that. I mean, what superstar do we ever see, play 5 years after they're no longer a starter? So I think to his credit, he did adjust and did accept where he was in his career, and was willing to take on a lesser role. And a couple things, Moses just freaking loved basketball, loved it. And not just basketball, but he loved being with the guys. He loved being in the locker room. He loved being around the teammates. He loved being one of the guys. It was one of the cool things I learned about Moses was he was incredibly humble. Even when he was the best basketball player in the world, the MVP, and as a guy who grew up with him told me, everybody around Moses changed the way they look at him, but he never looked at himself any differently. And that was really cool. And I think that enabled him to get along and earn the respect of his teammates, and to some extent continue to stick around after he no longer had it, because he did just love being one of the guys. And the second thing is, he really, I think really going back, till earlier in his career, he enjoyed being a mentor. He enjoyed teaching guys how to take care of their bodies, how to invest their money, how to, I don't know, little things. Take rookies under their wing, and hey, this is how you tip at a restaurant. Like little things like that people didn't know. And so there are a lot of players who told me that he really looked out for them and taught them the ways of the league. And, I mean, the 2 biggest names are, I think, Hakeem and Barkley, but Muggsy was one of those guys that, you never heard of. I mean, like a guy named Warren Kidd, who I think played 1 season for the 76ers in like 93, 94. Moses looked out for him. Moses tried to teach him how to make it in the league. And so he loved the game, and he loved being around the guys.
Yeah. He's it speaks to his character, because there are no stories about Moses being he didn't get along with writers and was a little taciturn, as you mentioned, but like there are no stories about any problems off the court, or some of these guys today, when the money's so big, they have a superstar aura. There's a little bit of a prima donna. Like right. There's just no pretense to them.
Yeah. Yeah, he really did. I mean, it's one of the things I admire about him. I mean, who knows how you would act if you were a multimillionaire and the MVP of the league, right? But I'd like to think that I would treat the 12th man on the roster the same way I would treat Julius Erving, and I like to think that that when that fourth round draft pick, who may or may not make the team, comes into camp, that I'd welcome him and make him feel comfortable. Um, and everything I've heard is that Moses did that. He was that kind of guy, and that extended to not just teammates, but the janitor in the arena, and the guy selling tickets and those kind of people too. I think it's really hard to do, to remain that humble, because money and fame does change people, and frankly, it's probably even harder now because the money is so obscene. Um, but it was a challenge then, I think, to stay grounded.
Yeah, sure. Now, I've a couple of final questions that are a little harder. If you were magically transport Moses from like 1982 to today's NBA, like you didn't adjust his game or anything, you just like let him loose in this, even though the style is different. How good would you think he would be in this environment?
That's tough, Harlan, because I mean, it's such a different game.
It's
Um,
apples and oranges, but in my
yeah,
experience, like there are guys who kick ass and get rebounds and just run through people today too. Not quite the way Moses did, but getting the ball still is important.
yeah, absolutely. And to that point, I think he'd be a really good player. Um, I don't think he could be an MVP type player, because I don't think he had the skills that you need as a big man in today's game. I don't think he could shoot or handle or pass the way that a Jokic or an Embiid or even like a Sabonis can, or Karl Anthony Towns. The great big men in the league now, they're more multi-skilled than he was offensively, and I just think teams wouldn't, in today's game, they're not going to just throw the ball to him on the block and let him do his thing. Um,
Yeah, I would see him more as a guy to get the boards himself. Though I would see him running right through Towns and Sabonis.
yes, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Which is why I think he'd be very good, and maybe even an all-star. I don't, but I think he'd be somewhat limited. Now, if he came up today, I think with his talent and his work ethic, he would have developed the skills he needed to be a great player in today's game. I think he'd be better if he came in today's game if he came up now than if you transported him, because I think he would become a very good shooter, and I think he'd become a much better ball handler, because that's how he would get paid.
Yeah, I also kind of get this. If you study history, like the great players, as the game evolves and they're still in the game, they tend to evolve with it. The guys from the '80s who didn't shoot threes by like the early '90s. Dominique shot no threes in 1983, but by 1990 he was like 91, he was hitting it. So I
Yeah,
think there's something to say that the best players tend to adjust.
yeah, absolutely. Because one of the things people have asked me what made him so great, and it's you can throw a lot of different qualities in the soup. It's a mixture of things, and one of them, which I think doesn't get talked about but has to, is basketball IQ. He had a very high basketball IQ. I don't care. People think of him in his brute force, right, and just overpowering, and his relentless drive and overwhelming people. All true. But you don't win 3 MVP awards unless you have a really high basketball IQ. You have to understand the game, and the great ones do, and because of that, to your point, I think are able to adapt.
Okay, so that leads me to my last question, which is also a little hard and totally subjective. Where do you think, based on your own criterion, he ranks on the center list all time?
Um, yeah, that's hard. It's so hard to compare across generations, right? I
Yeah,
think I mean I start with uh I mean, to me it's Kareem, Russell, and Wilt are the top three. Um, and then you get into Shaq and Olajuwon, and
and that's where it gets
Yeah, I think the next cluster, I would say Shaq, Olajuwon, Moses, and Jokic. I actually think if you look at their careers at the same age, Moses and Jokic's resumes are very similar. They both had 3 MVP awards. They both won one championship. Um, uh, that's a good argument. Who's better, Moses or Jokic? Um, and I think I'd probably give Shaq and Hakeem the nod over Moses. But I think it's a discussion. And so that's 5 ahead of them. And then him or Jokic, I guess at this point I'd give Moses the edge over Jokic on longevity to some extent, right? Theoretically, if Jokic's career ended tomorrow, I think Moses's body of work is better. Um, but I think there's a good chance Jokic surpasses him in the next few years. So I'd put him right now. I'll put him at 6 after Wilt Chamberlain, Wilt is Chamberlain, Wilt Chamberlain, Bill Russell, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Shaq, Hakeem, and then Moses. I think is
And
what I'm probably doing.
definitely ahead of Robinson and Ewing.
Yeah, I think so. Definitely ahead of Ewing. It breaks my heart to say this. I probably put Robinson ahead of Ewing. And I think I'd take Moses over Robinson. I mean, that 3 MVP award thing that really sticks with me. That's big time. And Moses was the best player on a championship team. I think Duncan was, even in year 2, was better than Robinson in '99 and definitely in 2003. I don't. So that matters to me somewhat too.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely
I don't know. What do you
something
think? Where would you put him?
I have him in the same general tier that you do, ahead of Ewing's. For Ewing's, I don't want to call it futility, but he's just ultimately not quite as good as all those guys. Robinson's, I get agreed on the fringes. He was just such a sculpted athlete, though. It's hard, you do wonder if the context was different before, in the early years before Duncan, if would have been even better. But like you said, he has 1 MVP. Moses has 3. David Robinson has no titles without Tim Duncan. But it's close. And Jokic is really hard to assess because he's such an all-time offensive player and such a defensive, non-offensive, not a great player.
Yeah.
So like he's just like total apples and oranges. Like he's better than Ewing, but like, can you think of a center as such a good center who is so weak on defense? It's like hard to put into context.
I mean, probably even just if you just named every Hall of Fame center, I would guess that Jokic would be, and obviously he will be a Hall of Famer. I would guess that he would be the worst Hall of Fame center defensively.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I don't.
Yeah.
I can't even think of anyone comparable. Like I don't.
Yeah.
Because he's I mean, he's a liability. We're not just saying, oh, he's not a great shot blocker, whatever. He's a liability on that end. I mean, that, you talk about lesser centers. I don't know, like a guy like, well, Nate Thurman was an incredible defender, but like, say Robert Parrish, right, or Jack Sikma, guys like that who are in the Hall of Fame. Like Alonzo Mourning was a great center, but I don't know, Sikma, Parrish, guys who maybe weren't considered great defensive players, but like, they were a lot better than Jokic.
Yeah, well, I mean, the goal is to put him in a pick and roll on every play, right? That's that's what the Warriors did in the playoffs a couple of years ago and the other night. But on the other hand, Jokic is like a point guard who can shoot, and it's just so hard to. He's such a unique player. The only thing that makes me think some of these other guys I might take over him is that when Jokic goes against other bigs who are like really big, he has trouble with them mano a mano on defense. So, but his
and that's when it gets into the era too, right? Because he could. Well, I don't know. It's different. It's the different ways, right? Now he gets killed in the pick and roll, whereas in the 80s, he would have got killed by Moses or Olajuwon or Ewing or whoever in the post. Either way, he would have got killed.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So
I think he might have fared better against as a post center than having to move around in space because he's just not that agile.
yeah, and I don't. He's really good, so I don't want to. I don't want to
No.
disparage
I
him.
hear
Yeah.
you. He's a weird player in that regard. And look, I mean, we're talking about we're talking about the top. He's the top 10 center of all time, right? So okay, so is he 10 or is he 7? Even if he's 10, like that's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, but I think he naturally fits with Malone just because of their like they play totally differently, but their motor is just like they don't stop moving in their own way, and
Yeah.
they're like pretty no frill. So I put them on the tier. I could see the arguments both ways, but you can't. They've accomplished a bit more than Robinson, and then poor Patrick is great, but just you know just not meant to be. What can I tell you?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, he's just not as good. He was just not as good as those guys,
Right.
And,
He was some player, but
and that's okay. It's okay to be the whatever 8th greatest center in the history of basketball. That's all right.
Yeah, I know, but he'd probably be pissed off if he heard us.
Yeah.
But what are you gonna do? So
He's
anyway,
heard worse. He played in New York for what 14 years, whatever it was. He's heard a lot worse than that.
I guess that's fair. So well, thank you for coming on. I had a great time. Um, the book is Moses Malone, The Life of a Basketball Prophet. I suggest everyone go out and buy it. I already did. I'm getting my way through it, but a lot of fun. Good luck on the book, and we'll see you. We'll see what the next book is. I know it takes a couple of years, but I'm sure you have something in the hopper once you're finish promoting this one.
Well, thank you, Harlan. Thank you so much for having me on. I told you, I reached out to you. I said, I'll never forget. It was my first book, and the first book will always be special. And you were the first person to reach out to me. I ended up doing a lot of interviews, but you were the first person to reach out to me to do an interview for that book, and I'm eternally grateful. So thank you again for having me on.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Always fun. So I guess I'll stop recording. Or maybe I won't, but I will in my head stop recording. Okay, I think I did. All right, perfect. All right, well, that was awesome, Paul. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it.
All right, so I'll post this hopefully as a transcription and a video. Once my wife will do the video stuff because that's not my thing. But it was a lot of fun, and I look forward to reading the rest of the book. And I hope it's going good.
Yeah, it's so far so good. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks again for having me on, and keep in touch.
All right. Likewise.
All right. Take care, Harlan.
Okay. Bye-bye.